This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
It's just the two of us today.
It is. Anything could happen, couldn't it? Really?
It could. Well, I'm actually pretty happy today because we're not coming back for politics.
No, that's right. Yeah, it was good. Probably good timing too. We curbed that at week 2.
And I think that obviously Stu's not opening the episode today, but I think after the last 2 episodes, he had to go and take a sabbatical, maintaining order.
So Stu's on holidays. Stu's over in Japan on holidays. So it's just you and I. We got a good topic.
Yeah, we
got a great topic today. We're going to actually talk about Christian spirituality. I know that's a big way of casting the topic, but this is a bit of a big picture perspective on Christian spirituality in terms, we're going to talk about prayer, we're going to talk about general sense of how we experience God, spiritual transformation, this sort of thing. Now, those sound like different topics, but actually one of the things that we want to sort of get to is the realization that actually they're all kind of the same. There is one kind of fundamental direction here. But it's interesting, in my conversations and as a pastor, in my conversations with people, I find there are some really fundamental misunderstandings that people have about the nature of the Christian life, about prayer, about the process of transformation that we're part of. Mm-hmm. So I think the perspectives that we bring on this today, I think will be important in terms of casting a bit of context. And I guess a good place to start. And look, I mean, it's the consummate struggle for the average, the average Christian, isn't it? And I mean, if we just think of the symptoms, it's like, it's that sense of God being really with you. And when you pray, your mind wanders and you're so conscious of this, of the problems, that you have, your attitudes and towards others. And you just feel like you need to get fixed, and you sort of feel, then you kind of feel ashamed of that, and then you feel like, well, why doesn't God help me with that, or how even is God going to help me with that? Yeah. And it goes on and on and on. Doesn't it?
We all have that struggle. Yeah. I mean, I've kind of had to work through that most of my life. I think I understand it a little bit better now, so I kind of know where you're going with this to some degree. But certain conversations I have with people, it's hard to understand, like when you consider all those things in isolation. Even like what is faith and what is prayer and what is worship and what does God want to do for us? What's he trying to do in our lives? If you understand them all in isolation, it's kind of hard to think through, well, what's the big picture that sits behind really the reason why God wants us to do anything at all? And so when you kind of you can get frustrated with prayer, for example, because you're kind of not really sure, well, what am I supposed to experience with this? Right. And I get frustrated. And so you talk to people, lots of people, any conversation, I think we all have this problem. We get frustrated because we feel like, every time we sit down and pray, we don't have that real kind of clear connection with God. We don't emerge from it having a sense of achieved something with God. And so if you take that through all of our sort of the way that we approach all of our Christian life, I feel like I'm always wrestling with, but why didn't you do this, God? Where were you in this? Why are you silent? Or why aren't you fixing me? It should be better than this. I sort of bring all my own sort of the false perspectives into that situation, and it just sort of sets me up for failure. We do set ourselves up for failure, and there's a sort of paralyzing confusion associated with all of that. And essentially what a point I'd really like to make in this conversation, Connell, is that there actually is something beautifully simple about it. Now we are complex. We are enormously complex, and we're in a very complex culture, and there are very complex ways in which our culture and even the way that we are conditioned within that culture, there are many obstacles that does throw up. That
our human natures grab onto, right? We're not just victims of this, but, our very dysfunctional human nature grabs onto these things, and we get in such a knot and we get really confused. Mm-hmm. And a lot of this comes back to how we understand God and how we understand ourselves. It really comes back to the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And often people just assume, oh, look, I understand that there's a God and I understand that I'm a child of God, but, right? Now, the problem lies in we don't really quite understand those two things.
Which is unbelievable.
And we think we do. It's like we assume that we do. And so we're not going to cover everything that we've covered in the past. But, the example with this, even with understanding God that we've talked about before, is this sense that, there's a God sitting up there on a throne up in heaven, a sort of monopolytheism, I've described it, like the Zeus kind of figure sitting out there. And wouldn't he just come down and hang out with me for a bit, and then he can go back and so we get this sort of this sense of the Christian life as intermittent experience of divine intervention. God comes down, does something, and then goes back. And it's just not the way God is. God is the creator and sustainer of all things, and we are, constantly experiencing God all the time. Is constantly at work in our lives, even just sustaining. Even our life is just the outflow of who He is. So there's a sense in which every single human being is already experiencing the goodness of God, and this point is made in a number of different ways throughout Scripture. So the key is actually coming into right relationship with God.
Yeah, yeah.
The fundamental issue in life, because when it comes to understanding ourselves, we're completely relational in the sense that we're not just an object or a machine. Or I think it's important that we understand our identity relationally. We are, in a sense, our relationships. Mm-hmm. That is what defines us, and primarily we are children of God. Mm. And I know, look, I know that they're going to be listening. Yeah, I know that. I've been told that. I get that.
Yeah.
And it can become frustrating because there's a desire to experience that. So let's, we'll get there.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing is to recognize that pretty much every dysfunction in our lives and in the world today flows from a misrelation between us and God of some kind.
Yeah.
Everything flows from that, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm talking humanity at large. Okay, so even when we suffer things that aren't our fault, often the way that we respond to that sows into that misrelation. We get things happen to us, and we get knocked about. And we take up attitudes, where we start judging and playing God, and this is just an example, where essentially we find ourselves in the way that we respond in a kind of misrelation. Someone treats us like an object, so we start thinking of ourselves like just an object, and so we lose a sense of our sacred value, which comes from us again being beloved children of God, and so we can, I think, trace. We can trace essentially all. I mean, I'm going to say that cautiously, because there are other issues. I'm thinking of like psychiatric issues, and that if we can just shelve that for a moment, because I think one of the things we need to recognize is that everything is relational.
Yeah,
everything comes back to that. To that relationship with God. Now, that's important to recognize in any situation that we're in. The main thing is always going to be the relationship with God in that situation.
And it's an interesting point, because it's often like we're missing information. We feel like we're missing something, missing some information. Maybe it's a theological truth, or, like there's something that I'm just not getting. Like I just need to hear something. And it's probably frustrating, as a pastor and a preacher. You communicate as well as you can a lot of concepts about being in relationship with God, but still somehow something doesn't sink in. It's like a disconnect between the facts. Like we can tell people about the identity, their identity in God. We can talk about the dysfunction in the relationship with God, and you can believe all of that and hang on to it. But there's still like some other gap that is hard to cross. that can take years, almost like all your life of, living as a Christian, consuming sermons, studying the Bible, listening to podcasts, consuming information. And yet it's almost like, but it's all so much simpler at the top. The real underlying problem, as you say, is relational. Now, you can take that as a fact, but relational, in order to fix relational, you have to enter into relationship. So it's not missing information you need.
Yeah.
You need to.
That's a good point.
It's only through relationship.
Yeah, so we can easily think I need more of something.
Yeah.
I need more ability or more power or more self-discipline or more or more understanding and there are elements of truth to all that, particularly if we understanding in terms of a very relational understanding. But yeah, we can easily be trying to build things into our lives and miss the fact that unless that serves that core relationship, then it's just more baggage, essentially. And so I think because one of the other things here is there's a slight cultural tendency, I think, for us to objectify ourselves. We're these sort of psychological, physical machines, and in our culture we talk a lot about well-being, and we tend to think of that in mechanistic sort of terms, my psychological well-being and my physical well-being. And if all of that's, if everything's aligned, it's like having your car serviced, and getting your wheel alignment done and getting the tires fixed and so your motor's just purring and it steers really nicely and you got your steering fluid and everything's, everything's been topped up, windscreens are clean. It's just like, that's, and I think we have this sense that that's what we need. We need to get, we're these objects, these mechanistic objects that need to get fixed. And so we have this expectation that either the reason why I can't relate to God is because maybe some people might think is because I'm too broken or something and I can't quite get there. I can't bridge the distance because there's too much wrong with me, right? So I've just got to get fixed. And then if I can only get fixed, then I can relate to God. Or the expectation that, yes, I feel very much in the hands of God, but now my expectation is that God is just going to do something to just fix me, and then I can get on with my life once I'm fixed. And it'll all be okay when I'm fixed.
It's like a self-help.
Yeah, that's right.
It's another avenue for self-help. And there's a lot of people will approach Christianity and approach God with that. And maybe that's even where they start the journey as well, is that they know all of that and they see it as a mechanism to get that self-help because they've tried other things. So it's actually not an invalid starting point.
No.
We'll use those things to start us off on the journey. But that's, I guess, the premise of which we're trying to start the journey isn't the right, how God wants us to start. And this is then where the relationship comes in, because, and an aspect of, it's not just receiving the right bit of knowledge, it's about discovering the real problem, the real truth, and discovering for yourself who God really is. So it's a reframing of it that you have to relationally discover.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely, those are valid concerns, and we talk about, we use the language of brokenness. It's slightly problematic as well, that language. Our metaphors can push too hard, and that one does get pushed hard. We're all broken people. And I think it's, in one sense, it's fine to use that, but it does so slightly into this mechanistic understanding of human identity.
Yeah.
And I know this is a very abstract sort of topic, and I, to speak about human identity, what actually are we and how are we to see ourselves? I've said that the problem is that we tend to objectify that. And look, inevitably, it's that relational understanding of human identity, I think, is inescapable in that, even in the present day with our obsession with human image and how we present ourselves and things like social media. And, the obsession with sort of our personal image and building our identity, which is a big thing in our culture, right? Yeah. That is a kind of self-objectification, but it's also comes from a need to be defined relationally because, for me to feel some sense of value, because we all have this intuition of value that my life has meaning and value, right? Mm-hmm. And our desire to be loved is essentially a desire to have our value acknowledged. It's the deepest human need that there is, right? Because we are absolutely sacred of infinite value as children of God. And so there's no deeper inclination in us than the inclination to have that value acknowledged and affirmed, right? But when we cut ourselves off from God, from whom the flow of that value, it's under the gaze of God that is the ultimate affirmation of our value, right? You are loved by God. And it's under the hand of God, under the loving gaze of God, that is the sunshine that brings to light our sacredness. That is the sunshine that brings the multifaceted, diamond of our value to light. But the problem is that once we move into the darkness, once we come out of that light, we have to construct that somehow ourselves. And I'm using this illustration, Connell, because, and you may have heard me use this illustration before as like a diamond. We're like a diamond. And when you look at a diamond, the first thing you want, in order to understand the beauty of a diamond, what do? You bring it into light, right? Mm-hmm. And a diamond is beautiful because of the way it refracts light, isn't it? Because the way it absorbs and refracts light. Yep. And I think this is a great illustration for human identity, because our sense of value, the glory that is in us as human beings, is how we absorb and refract and reflect the glory of God. Mm-hmm. There is actually no deeper desire within us than for the light of the glory of God to shine in us and through us, right? Yeah. We are made for the sunshine of the glory of God, right? And it's then that we see, it's in that light that we see each other, and that we really gain a sense of our value. Mm-hmm. And remember, this is a metaphor. It's just a metaphor, because the light that I'm describing is the light of God's love. It's the primary thing. Look, we were talking about near-death experiences, and what is the most fundamental thing that people experience when they have some sense of God, which is invariably the case. Mm-hmm. That is that those who have heavenly experiences, which is, anyway, let's not go there. Yeah. It is, isn't it? It's this overwhelming sense of love, mm-hmm. right? It's they are in the sunshine of God's love, and it's like it all makes sense now, right? Yep. So the thing is, when we go into the darkness, the longing doesn't dissipate, mm-hmm. right? We need that sense of value. And so what we essentially do is that we paint the diamond. We paint the diamond, and we paint layers over that to almost mimic perhaps the light. Imagine, you take a diamond that in the light reflects all this beautiful light, right? You take it into the darkness and there's no light being refracted, right? So what you do is that you dab paint all over it to make it look like it is, right? And essentially that's what we've done with human identity, and we've lost that sense of identity that is completely connected with God. And we've taken ourselves away from God. And so suddenly, and because identity is still essentially relational, the only way that I can get a sense of my identity is to have your approval in the way that, I'm going to paint the diamond, right? I'm going to wear an identity through my achievements and it's always going to be in comparison with other people, right? I'm going to try to make myself acceptable, mm-hmm. so that when you look at me, I gain your approval. Yeah. And that way I feel validated. Yeah.
And that sums up pretty much every struggle that we have.
Struggle that we have. And in fact, it's interesting. To take one of the most important works in political philosophy, if the last, few decades, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man, he sees at the core of all social political life is a desire for recognition. He sees that as the fundamental element of human need, is the need for recognition, right? Yeah. And it's the need to be honored and recognized by other people. Mm-hmm. And in a way, he's right. But that actually comes from a vacuum that has been created because the diamond has been taken out of the light, painted over. So this is the problem. When you take a painted diamond and you put it in the light, it doesn't absorb the light like it should.
The only problem with that analogy is it implies that we're painting the diamond as if we knew that the diamond was there. Have we ever known the diamond was there?
Yeah, all don't push metaphors too far.
No, I know, and I'm conscious of not doing that, but it kind of does imply a bit that we're aware of that in the first place. From the moment we're born, was that diamond there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, totally. You know what? Of course it is.
It's there.
You look at this is what we see in children, right? There's such a purity.
Yeah.
There's such a sense of their own confidence in their own sense of sort of self. And one of the most tragic things is when they start getting objectified, is when they come into a culture that just by the way that the culture is shaped, I mean, let alone when there's things like abuse and all that sort of stuff. And that comes in many different forms. And actually, look, I think our culture is, and when I say our culture, I'm actually talking about I'm going right back to the fall pretty much, because everything after the fall is painting over, is painting over that, and I think there's a sense in which there is a kind of an initial innocence. Now, it's much more complicated than that because we inherit a lot of stuff, right? We inherit a sort of fallenness or these deep tendencies, all of this multi-generational trauma, however you want to put it, generational sin in all of its different respects. And yet there is such a beautiful innocence. And this has been acknowledged for all time that there's something beautifully pure and spiritually porous about children. They absorb love, right? Yeah. They absorb love. If you deprive a child of love, it's the cruelest thing you can possibly do for a child. So I think it is there. And I also think the children are just innately and inherently sort of porous spiritually. Yeah. I think it's something that they start building up a crust, and it's in the context of our fallen world that they start building up that crust.
Well, of course, Jesus also refers to childlike faith and coming to God like children. Yeah. So, and it kind of makes sense that if we want to understand more of how we're supposed to relate to God, that's from the moment we enter the world, we're the least probably corrupted. We haven't really started to put all the layers of paint diamond. So that's going to come. We're just going to keep painting and painting and paint. So if we want to look at what's the most purest form, or maybe the greatest model of how we are to relate to God, we can look at that childlike faith as a pointer to that. And there's something in it. What is it that's so unique in it? Like, then children, all they want to do is be loved, and by their parents, and the security that they have and sense of confidence that they have in their parents and being in that family is all that they really need, isn't it? Like, they're not aspiring to move outside of that. It's almost like that's enough, being in that relationship in that family.
Yeah, although there's even there, I think this is why I think it's important, because parents aren't God and we can't be God to our children. And this is where I think more than anything as a parent, I've recognized the importance that my life has got to orbit around God, around the love of God. I mean, we're really pushing metaphors now. Our lives are not meant to orbit around other people.
No.
And, God is our source of light and love. And when my life orbits around God, because our children invariably orbit around us for that time, you know what I mean, until they establish their own explicit relationship with God, we take them with us in a sense. And so I think, I do think it's tragic when children grow up without any sense of their ultimate sacred value. Yes, it's great to be loved by another human being. And that is a kind of a dim reflection of God's love. But ultimately, all people need to know they need to be in the sunshine of God's love.
But it is a model, though, an imperfect one, like in the sense of how children relate to their.
Oh, you mean my metaphor? Are you affirming my metaphor? I could pile up metaphors, but this is the reason why. Actually, look, Connell, the reason why I love metaphors is because there's something so mysterious about this.
Yeah.
As soon as we try to circumscribe this in purely logical and analytical sense, we're back to the machine, right? And this is something very mysterious and relational, and so we use metaphors, and I think metaphors can be rightly used, and the Bible uses metaphors because there is, as medieval theologians point out, there's this great chain or hierarchy of being. So everything is connected, and so everything reflects upwards. You know what I mean? When we talk about light and diamonds and the way that, Bible talks about trees and nature and uses all these things of metaphor, but that's because everything speaks of the one thing. Everything testifies. There's one truth, and everything in a way is an analogy of the goodness and love of God.
Yeah,
that's my little footnote on the use of metaphors.
All metaphors have a limit, but they're good because they allow you to paint a picture in your mind that is hard to do with just words alone. It's always communicating a simple concept when you get it, when you get the point of the metaphor.
But it's also because our imagination is part of knowing.
Yes. Oh, yeah, that's key.
Because I mean, again, in our very scientifically oriented culture, we tend to think it's just maths and breaking things down into constituent parts. But the pictures, and this is inherent in the way that the Bible communicates to us. It communicates through symbols and pictures, right? Because there is something here that's so much bigger than language.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And everything that we do see testifies to it. So metaphors and pictures work. The Lord is my shepherd.
Yeah.
Oh, I can see that, right? I can see and feel that. There's something that I know more explicitly that relates to something that I know in a deeper kind of a way, but it helps to make that explicit. And so, so these metaphors that we're using, I think they're going to help get us hopefully away from this. We're just these machines needing to be fixed. I mean, that in itself is a dysfunctional metaphor in a sense, because I think we do imagine this is a case where we're imagining ourselves as something that we're actually not really. And so reaching for better metaphors is often a part of the imagining things differently is part of what we need to do.
Because in my mind, it's how I feel my relationship with God. And so those metaphors or those I guess it's experiences through the journey of life. How do I feel when I approach God seeing him as this kind of angry God that's got to be pacified all the time? Or do I see God as a shepherd? The Lord is my shepherd. Or how do I see him in terms of my own experience of family as well? Like there's a rest to me that these pictures of this just confidence and just trusting. Imagine being in a family where you all the time had to earn the approval of your parents all the time.
Yeah, well, there'd be an imagination issue there when you talk about God as Father then, wouldn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, and that is a reality for a lot of people, but we know that that's a broken model. But the model of, having a father in your mind, you can kind of learn a lot from the relationship with your own sort of earthly father. But at no point do you ever feel that you needed to keep pacifying your father to still be their child and to be loved by them. And even the idea of being in a family, it's like the right to be in that family is not contingent on every day beating myself up that I've not done this and not done that. And, I take that into my relationship with God, because one of the things that I think we all have to do in that journey, and this is through relational sort of learning about and discovering who God is, we need to learn to rest and not take every day of thinking, feeling like we've got some kind of deficit that we've got to keep making up all the time with God. It's as if there's scales all the time, like I did this and I didn't do that, and I didn't pray enough this day, and I let God down this way, or all of those kind of things. They kind of create this sense of deficit and trying to grab hold of God all the time, where I think the right model is that peace, just rest in the relationship.
So what you're talking about there, to come back to our metaphor, that's just more painting the diamond. It's just more a sense of, I've got to make this thing look good and convincing, and, I've got to do enough, and I've got to, it's often through our sense of personal achievement, or have I prayed enough, or all of that can become the classic sort of New Testament kind of Pharisaism. Was a lot about, wearing the robes and the phylacteries and the tassels and all of that, which was kind of, there was a biblical purpose for that to point to something else, but it became paint on the diamond. We can wear, in fact, probably, I've often said, the most compelling lies are those which are closest to the truth. and I think this is a case where there's a tragic irony in that very disciplined sort of prayer and religious behavior can become the most convincing paint on the diamond, when it's still a kind of false identity that we've built. We've just built this sort of false identity, and so life becomes about adjusting our sense of self and self-esteem, and this is what brings us back to the self-help thing. Loving yourself and attaining self-esteem and accepting yourself. And it's enormously problematic, because at the end of the day, what has to happen is that something actually has to be stripped back. It's not about more of this or more of that or more of this, And so this I think is the first sort of important step forwards. And I do want to be practical here, because we're floating around with this metaphor, which is fine. But essentially, the first thing that needs to happen is the stripping back of things that are false. Now, you and I are both big fans of Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation, right? Yep. One of the richest sort of spiritual, comes out of the Catholic tradition. And of course, there are plenty of things, out of the Catholic tradition that I wouldn't agree with so much. But this book is, I think, is one of the richest of spiritual writings in the Christian tradition. Big statement. It's one of the best things I've read. But one of the things that he talks about in New Seeds of Contemplation is the problem of the false self.
Yes.
Isn't so much of that, because he's talking, the book's about the contemplative state, and he's not just talking about contemplative personalities, or he's talking about a general posture of constant awareness of God, right? He's talking about relationship with God, right? He's talking about basking in the sunshine of an awareness of God's love and presence, right? Yeah. To which we have access through Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ gave us access to reconciliation with God, right? And so what happens, though, is that we believe in Jesus, right? Yes, I say yes to Jesus. I know that I need this. We come into the light. But the problem is the diamond's still painted. And what has to happen then? And initially there are cracks in the paint job that let a little bit of light through, right? Yeah. But what needs to happen from here is actually not primarily adding stuff, but stripping stuff away. I think this is probably the first important step. And it's going to help you to understand a lot of what God might be doing in your life is stripping away what's false. It's stripping away false identity. And that always feels like things are getting worse, right? I was just feeling good about myself. I lost this thing that actually gave me a sense of self-esteem, or I'm suddenly feeling like completely hopeless, right? Because I was feeling so propped up or so strong before, but now I feel completely hopeless, right? And that's because the false is being stripped away. So the
tug between you and God. Because the thing that I've learned is that probably I don't really want to give up my false self.
Oh, no, because we're like artists sculpting our own identities, and we do it over years and years and years.
Yeah.
And to put yourself in God's hand where he's just going to start sanding that stuff away, it just feels like, look, this is a wonderful thing. God does this gently and slowly. We actually, to be honest, we couldn't handle it if it all happened in one go. It's like if you've been in the dark and then you just get hit with a blinding light, it'll blind you. Mm-hmm. So God's going to turn up the light gradually, right? And that means just, okay, I'm going to strip this little bit away. I'm going to strip this little bit away. I'm going to strip this a little bit away. So it's the stripping away that he's asking us to sort of recognize, even cooperate. I'm going to continually allow these things to, let go of these things.
It's going against your will. No, hang on. God's not going to go against your will, but at some level you feel like you're having to let go of what you're holding on to. So it's not something that you don't want to. You've spent years building this up. I mean, it's core to who you are.
Yeah, and yet it's not convincing, Connell. It's deep down, we know it's not convincing. I mean, this is why in the Buddhist tradition, they have the doctrine of anatta, which is this sense of the falsehood of the self, right? It's, in fact, I think they take that too far in that they say there isn't a self under the paint job. There actually isn't anything there. Yeah. Because all that they perceive is, and I think the perception that what we take as being ourselves, in inverted commas, is fundamentally false. Now, that observation I think is right on. It is fundamentally false.
Yeah.
But there's not just non-being underneath there as is, held in the Buddhist tradition.
Yeah.
There is a being there, but a being who is completely defined in the dynamics of relationship with God. And it's only as the paint gets stripped back that the light begins to shine in the diamond and actually start refracting, and where the diamond, in a sense, discovers its value.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to fight with God on this to the day I die. And that is the sad realization, because I believe everything that you're saying. And I've read it in Thomas Merton's book as well, and it's such an eye opener and such a revelation, and I totally believe it. But I'm still going to wrestle with this, because the false self that controls me, I see it all the time behind how I approach every day, and I think this is where God actually then starts to speak into that. Once you realize that that's the issue there, is that you do see it in all of your interactions, and you have to make conscious decisions of, I'm reacting this way, and because I can see the connection of it to some other thing that I'm trying to achieve. And so if I let go of that, it may mean that, even in the church, it's not like in the church community, we're all kind of these really perfected sort of individuals, and I'm trying to become like everybody else. I feel like we're all struggling with it. And for me to let go, I'm almost even giving up. It's almost like not running the race anymore. And comparatively to other people, whether it's in the world or in the church, I have to give up on the race that I was running before.
Okay, well, you need to distinguish that from Paul's famous metaphor of running the race.
Yeah.
And Paul's metaphor aligns with the idea of walking with God. And we're keeping step with God, living by the Spirit, keeping step with the Spirit. But this is what the Spirit is doing. He's gradually stripping away those things. Now, you said just before that this is something you're going to struggle with for the rest of your life. Of course you are. Of course we all are. And this is, I think the problem here again is that we just want to get fixed. Can we just get fixed? Get all fixed, get all, perfected, and then we can get on with our lives. No, actually, it's the surrender. It's the process of transformation, of giving that false stuff over to God. What is the offering that we bring? Like, what is essentially the offering that God wants us to bring, right? Burnt offerings and sacrifices you did not desire. Psalm 51.
Yeah.
But a broken spirit and a contrite heart, right? So bring the falsehood, it's like bundle all that up and just put it in the light. And so it's continually this process of bringing not our righteousness, but our falsehood.
Yeah.
Bringing us as we are and just bringing that into light. Because, the tragic irony is a lot of people feel like, I can't come to God because there's still so much falsehood, because I'm such a hypocrite, because I'm so much this. Yes, that is the very thing. The tragedy there is this sense that people feel like they've got to go off, get that sorted, and then come back. There's an impossibility. You will never ever sort that. The only way that's going to be sorted out is in the presence of God. Only God can strip back that. It's almost like the way in the light, the way paint fades in the light. Like you just keep that thing in the light. And it's a long, slow, and this is where we come back to where we started, kind of at the start. It's a relational process.
Yeah.
If we're just an object that needs to get fixed, like why doesn't he just fix the object? Mm-hmm. No. We are completely relational. So it's all about the building of a relationship. It's about us bit by bit yielding ourselves over to God. Now, it's not going to happen any faster than our will is transformed. And that kind of relational building, that building of trust, of love, of awareness, that's inevitably a long, slow process, and it's going to grow and grow and grow for as long as we live. This life is about that process of transformation.
And it seems to me that that's how God works. He always takes the long, slow road to get there.
But there isn't any. I mean, again, if it's about fixing an object, why doesn't he just click his fingers and we get fixed? But that's not who we are. We are relational, and so we are becoming more and more who we're meant to be as that relationship is built and built and built. This means that, by the way, every single circumstance, even circumstances that we might deplore, even circumstances I may say that God deplores, things that happen in this world that, Jesus wept over the death of his friend. Through every circumstance, the main thing is always, how are we responding to God? Everything is about how we relate to God in that circumstance.
So he's trying to teach us something in how we respond as well. Because why doesn't God just fix us? Because if God was to fix you, you wouldn't have learnt to respond in the right way. And so
and a relationship is about communication, is the back and forth of two, in the deepest sense, is us in this interaction, this relational interaction with God. And that's a process.
Yeah. And so he needs to teach us that in how we interact with things, he needs to allow us to experience and discover how to react and respond into things, situations, in a way that draws on faith and trusting him and allowing him to do what he wants, which is often against what we innately want to do. And I think there's also another level to this. It's not just about fixing me. God also wants to turn me into the person that he needs me to be, because whilst there's all sorts of issues connected to me, we're all interconnected. So I think God's working on a much bigger fix than just fixing me. So
good point.
He needs to get me and my character and my faith and my trust in him to actually to develop to a point where through that my experience and my relationship with God, it actually impacts on other people and solves other problems.
Yeah, well, another way of putting that is that there is no just me in the truest sense. Yeah. There is us, and we are, yes, of course we have a sense of individual identity. In fact, it's the Bible that essentially validates the sense of individual identity and God's concern for individuals. Yet at the same time, we are God's children together. And if I objectify you, if I treat you as an object, you are the mirror through which I see myself. If I treat you as an object, if I hate you, if I treat you as a means to an end, that automatically makes me an object, because how I see you reflects directly on how I see myself. Yeah. So the objectification of other people reflects back on how we see ourselves. And then it goes the other way, and then how we see ourselves. Yeah. So, this is where love your neighbor as yourself is so, important, because how we see ourselves in terms of in our relationship with God reflects on how we see our neighbors, but then how we see and treat our neighbors then reflects back on how we treat ourselves. Yeah. A lot of this is played out. So you're stripping back the diamond. If I'm relating to you and I'm only concerned about using you as a means to an end or getting you to like me, for example, rather than actually just reflecting, like really loving you, reflecting God's love and your inherent sacred value to you, then I'm actually I'm doing further damage to myself. So by learning to love other people, learning to forgive other people is going to be transforming for me.
Yeah. So another example how I see that working is that, like if someone treats me badly and then I think, well, I could say, well, look, God, fix this situation, make this person treat me better. God's solution there can actually be for me to endure that poor treatment from another person in order for me to develop a sense of trusting, just leaving it with God. You don't need to fix this situation, God. I'm okay to be in this particular situation that's impacting me. I'm willing to trust you in that. You know what you're doing in this, even though you're not going to fix it. That's an important lesson to learn. I have to be confident that you know, God, what you're doing, even though you're not fixing it for me. What emerges out of that is a change in my relationship to God and how I view God, and a change in how I then start to relate to that other person.
That's right.
And then that other person, I then become an instrument for them to also discover that in terms of how I'm relating to God and responding to them, it starts to have an impact on them as well. So God's plan isn't just to fix me, it's to fix the other person as well. So that's just like,
well, you reflect something to the other person. Then it's like when we continue to love other people, though they that might mistreat us, we're first of all saying you're not then the other person that's mistreated us. We're saying I'm not going to treat you as a means to make me feel good for a start. You know what I mean? I'm going to reflect back to you that you are of ultimate sacred value. And essentially that's what love, that's where I think love is so transformative, because we're seeing through the paint job, right? Because even if it's an aggressive paint, we're actually saying no, underneath that. Underneath all of that, all of those defensive layers, and it could be aggression, and it could be a manifesting stuff that we hate. Right? They're the wrong political party, the wrong opinions. They're they've got this personality. They're overbearing. They're aggressive. They're defensive. They're all of the things we list. All that's just part of the paint job, right? That's all just part. All of that's just that dysfunctional stuff that we clothe over the top of this deep gnawing pain of emptiness from our original separation with God. And so to love another person is to acknowledge, no, underneath that, there is a diamond underneath that. And I'm gonna shine the light of love on that. Because there are always cracks. There are always cracks in the paint job, so the little bit of light gets in. Now, when I do that to another person, I am going to more likely than believe that of myself. Yeah, and so it naturally reflects back on me.
Yeah. So we're just looking there at one small dimension, and we're nearly sort of out of time. But to bring it back to something, what is this? How does it impact in terms of relationally with God? But, those examples we had is just one dimension with one person, but extrapolate that, to all the complexity of everything that's going on in the world. I'm just one kind of small part of that. So what God is doing in me, it's not about just fixing me. It's changing me into the person that I need to become, so that I become an agent of change itself within the world.
Well, I become the this goes back to Genesis chapter 1, doesn't it? Like we are the reflectors of the image of God. It comes back to the diamond thing. When I say, and again, we're not thinking like an object here. We're thinking of, we are spiritual beings and reflectors of the glory and the love of God. Bringing that into every situation, remembering that. There's a lot more to say about this, but I think the key thing is remembering that everything comes back to that relationship with God. It's so much the core of everything that we need to, in every situation. When I wake up today, I've got all these things to do. I've got hassles with this, or I've got, these concerns. That the most important thing of all is that relationship.
So I think for me personally, the thing that I've probably learned about God sort of later in life compared to earlier in life is this whole idea of just resting in the assurance that he actually does love me and that I don't have to prove my faith, but I also I don't have to prove my faith to him or prove anything to him. I can actually trust the fact that he has actually got me. And so there's a sense of rest that comes with that now, even though I fail left, right and centre and I've got so many things I need to do better. Like I'm so far from being the person that God, really, and I know these things and I know I'm failing, but I kind of learned to just, in the big picture, it is just that relationship, and the relationship has to be based on some sense of just security in the fact that I can just rest in that, and that cuts across like sort of everything for me. So that even when I fail, I don't beat myself up about it. I'm just kind of full of gratitude in a way that I can fail and God we're still okay.
Yeah.
We're still okay. It doesn't change anything. I just can just rest. I don't know how else to articulate it, but there's a sense of resting in that rather than that sense of striving for something. And striving still important.
Well, and the striving, which is, such a cultural issue for us now, because we just live at 100 miles an hour and we're constantly doing things. Essentially, we're curating our own lives. And so the constant agitation of busyness. I mean, and I know it's a bit of a cultural thing. We sort of need to keep pace anyway with our culture. And this is perhaps something we can move on to in the next episode, to talk about practices that are going to actually help this and help the process. Because there are, I think, some things that we can do to help us find this rhythm or this space. But yes, I think it's already an important realization to recognize that there's so much of what we do, and it's not about what we do that's wrong. It's often about why we do it. It's the endless sort of busyness of feeling like I've got to validate my existence here. It's the endless busyness of curating, painting the diamond. I'm curating my own life, and I think one of the most beautiful and restful things we can do is to realize, because there is this thing within you that says you must keep going, keep curating, because otherwise you're not worth it and you're not. The most restful thing that we can recognize is that not only do we not have to do things for that reason, we still need to be involved in the world. We're not going to go and sit on mountaintops and do nothing, as nice as that would be. But the most important realization that we can have is that I don't have to do those things for that reason. I don't have to validate and least of all by religious achievements. I just need to keep in step with God. I just need to bring myself into oneness with God, keep myself in the light. And there is a rest that we can find in there. And in the next episode, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can move towards that.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.